August 1945. Germany lies in ruins. The swastika has fallen. But in a quiet headquarters in Bavaria, one American general sits across from a journalist and says something that will end his career. We defeated the wrong enemy. General George S. Patton Jr., the man who broke the German army, the commander who struck faster and harder than anyone thought possible. Now, with victory achieved, he's saying it was all a mistake. The room goes silent. Within months, Patton will be dead. His words buried. His warnings ignored. But 70 years later, we're still living with the consequences of not listening. This is the story of what Patton saw and what everyone else refused to see. April 1945. Patton's Third Army is racing across Germany like a force of nature. His tanks cover 50 miles in a single day. German commanders surrender, not because they're beaten, but because they can't keep up with where Patton is. Eisenhower's other armies are still fighting for every town. Patton has already crossed 3 rivers and liberated 2 concentration camps. He's not just winning. He's rewriting what victory looks like. But something is bothering him. Something none of the other generals seem to notice. As his tanks push east, they keep running into another army. Not the Germans. The Soviets. And Patton doesn't like what he sees. Soviet troops are looting, raping, executing civilians without trial. They're treating liberated Poland worse than the Germans did. Patton watches them strip entire factories, load them onto trains, and ship them back to Moscow. This, Patton realizes, is not an ally. This is a conqueror. He starts writing letters. Urgent ones. To Eisenhower. To Marshall. To anyone who will listen. We may have been fighting the wrong people. He writes. No one wants to hear it. It's April 12th, 1945. Patton is 70 miles from Berlin. His tanks are fueled. His men are ready. The road ahead is nearly undefended. He knows he can take Berlin in 48 hours. He calls Eisenhower. I can be in Berlin before the Russians. Eisenhower's answer is immediate. Stop where you are. Patton can't believe it. The capital of Nazi Germany, the ultimate prize of the entire war, is sitting there waiting to be taken. And he's being told to wait. Why? Patton demands. Political considerations. Eisenhower says. We've already agreed to let the Russians take Berlin. It's been decided at Yalta. Patton slams down the phone. He understands immediately what no one else seems to grasp. Whoever takes Berlin controls post-war Germany. Whoever controls Germany shapes the peace. And Eisenhower is handing it to Stalin, the man who has already swallowed Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The man whose troops are committing atrocities that rival anything the SS ever did. Patton sees the next 40 years unfolding in that single decision. But his hands are tied. Bradley later admits that the halt order was one of the biggest mistakes of the war. Even Churchill, across the Atlantic, is furious. He cables Truman begging him to let the Americans take Berlin. But the political decision has been made. Roosevelt and Truman have already promised Stalin everything east of the Elbe River. Patton watches as Soviet flags rise over Berlin, as the Red Army encircles the city, as Stalin carves up Europe, exactly as Hitler would have, only this time the Allies have given him permission. Years later, historians will debate whether the Cold War was inevitable. Patton knew it was, because he watched it begin. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Champagne flows. Soldiers celebrate. The war is over. Patton doesn't celebrate. He's now military governor of Bavaria. Part of his job is denazification, removing former Nazi Party members from positions of power. It sounds simple. But Patton immediately sees the problem. Germany is in ruins. There's no food, no electricity, no running water. The infrastructure has collapsed, and the only people who know how to make anything work are the people who ran things under Hitler. The telephone operators were Nazis. The train engineers were Nazis. The clerks who know where the grain stores are. All Nazis. This Nazi thing, Patton writes in his diary, is just like a Democratic and Republican election fight. It's not that he likes Nazis. He despises them. He's seen the concentration camps. He's seen the ovens. He knows what they did. But he also sees something else. The Soviets are rebuilding their sector of Germany faster because they don't care who was a Nazi. They only care who can work. Meanwhile, the Americans are so obsessed with punishing former party members that they're watching their zone collapse into starvation and chaos. Patton makes a calculation, a ruthless one. He starts ignoring denazification orders. He keeps former Nazis in administrative positions if they're competent. He focuses on feeding people and rebuilding infrastructure instead of revenge. Eisenhower is furious. The press finds out. Newspapers back home call Patton a Nazi sympathizer, a traitor. Politicians demand his removal. But Patton doesn't back down. I've been just as opposed to Nazis as anyone, he tells reporters. But we've got to run this place efficiently. And the Russians are watching. They're going to swallow us if we don't get our act together. He's trying to win the next war, while everyone else is still celebrating the last one. September 22nd, 1945. A reporter asks Patton about denazification policy. Patton, exhausted and frustrated, speaks his mind. This Nazi thing is just like a Democratic and Republican election fight. The ordinary German is not a Nazi any more than a Republican or Democrat is dangerous. The words hit American newspapers like a bomb. Eisenhower relieves Patton of command within weeks. The official reason is the denazification controversy. But Patton knows the real reason. He's been too loud about the Soviets, too insistent that the war ended with the wrong enemy defeated. He's been saying things no one wants to hear. We promised the Europeans freedom, Patton writes. It would be worse than dishonorable not to see that they have it. This might mean war with the Russians. But what of it? What of it, indeed? In Washington, generals and politicians look at those words with horror. War with the Soviets. After 6 years of war. After millions dead. But Patton sees what they don't. The Soviets aren't going to stop. They're going to keep pushing. And every day America waits, they get stronger. In 10 years. Patton predicts, we'll be wishing we'd dealt with this now. He's off by 5 years. The Korean War begins in 1950. December 9, 1945. Patton is in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His neck is broken. He's paralyzed from the neck down. The circumstances are strange. The army truck that hit his car was making an illegal turn. The driver was never properly questioned. Years later, conspiracy theories will swirl about whether it was truly an accident. But in that hospital bed, Patton knows he's dying. He spends his final days talking to visitors, still warning about the Soviets, still insisting that the war ended wrong. I should have gone to Berlin, he says. On December 21st, he dies of a pulmonary embolism. He's buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers he commanded. Not in a general cemetery. Among the men who fought for him. His warnings die with him. Here's what Patton understood in 1945 that almost no one else did. The Soviets weren't liberators. They were conquerors. Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections in Poland, Czechoslovakia, or anywhere else the Red Army reached. Every promise made at Yalta was going to be broken. The window to stop them was closing. The American army was still mobilized, still in Europe, still powerful. The Soviets were exhausted too. If there was ever going to be a confrontation, it had to be then, while both sides were still engaged. Germany would be the fault line. Stalin wanted all of it. Letting him take Berlin meant letting him define post-war Europe. Patton saw that whoever controlled Germany controlled the continent. Practicality mattered more than ideology. Yes, many Germans had been Nazis. But running a country required administrators, engineers, and bureaucrats. Purging everyone with a party membership meant paralysis, and paralysis meant vulnerability. The next war was already beginning. Everything that happened from 1945 to 1991, the Berlin Wall, the Korean War, Vietnam, the nuclear standoff, all of it was visible to Patton in those final months of World War II. And here's what America's leadership saw. The American people were exhausted. They wanted their sons home. They wanted peace. The idea of fighting another war, especially against an ally, was politically impossible. Stalin was necessary. They'd needed Soviet help to defeat Hitler. The cost of that help was going to be high. But it seemed better than fighting alone. International cooperation was the future. Roosevelt and Truman believed in the United Nations, in negotiated settlements, in the idea that the worst of human nature could be managed through diplomacy. Punishing Nazis was morally necessary. After the Holocaust, after the death camps, there was no way to simply forgive and move on. Justice demanded accountability. Patton was unstable. His comments were inflammatory. He was brilliant in war, but dangerous in peace. Two visions. Both sincere. Both certain they were right. Only one would be proven correct. March 1946. Winston Churchill stands in Fulton, Missouri, and delivers a speech that finally says what Patton had been saying for a year. From Stettin, in the Baltic, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Everything behind that curtain, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, is now a Soviet satellite. Their populations live under dictatorships as brutal as anything Hitler imagined. The Cold War is now official. American troops will remain in Europe for the next 70 years. Billions will be spent on defense. Proxy wars will rage across the globe. The nuclear arms race will push humanity to the brink of extinction. All of it could have been different if Patton had been allowed to race to Berlin. If the Americans had drawn the line at the Oder River instead of the Elbe. If the West had been willing to confront Stalin when both sides were exhausted and the choice was still available. But they weren't. Patton saw it. Churchill saw it. A handful of others saw it. But seeing the future doesn't matter if no one will listen. Here's the part no one wants to say out loud. Patton was right about the Soviets. He was right about Berlin. He was right that the window to stop Soviet expansion was in 1945, not 1950. But he was also impossible. Arrogant. Incapable of political nuance. He said inflammatory things about Nazis that, regardless of his intentions, made him sound like he was defending the indefensible. He was the right general for war, but maybe the wrong general for peace. And yet, the men who replaced him, the diplomatic, cautious, politically savvy leaders, presided over the loss of half of Europe, over the Berlin airlift, over the Korean War, over the endless twilight struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century. They were easier to work with, more polished, better at managing politicians and the press. But, were they right? Let's count the cost of not listening to Patton. East Germany endured 45 years of totalitarian rule. Families divided by the Berlin Wall. Secret police. Show trials. A surveillance state that made the Gestapo look amateur. Poland. Promised freedom at Yalta, got Soviet occupation instead. The nation that sparked World War II, by resisting tyranny, ended up under an even worse tyranny. Korea was divided, then invaded. Millions died in a war that ended in stalemate because China, emboldened by Soviet support, entered the conflict. Vietnam happened because America felt it had to stop communist expansion somewhere. 50,000 American dead, millions of Vietnamese dead, all because the containment line hadn't been drawn in 1945. The nuclear arms race nearly ended civilization. We came within minutes of annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, all because two superpowers faced off over a world divided in the wreckage of Germany. Would all of this have been prevented if Eisenhower had let Patton take Berlin? We'll never know. But we know what did happen, and Patton warned us it would. History is written by the victors. And the victors of World War II wrote a narrative of moral clarity. Democracy triumphed over fascism. Good defeated evil. The alliance held. But Patton's story doesn't fit that narrative. It's the story of a man who won the war but lost the peace, who saw clearly but spoke clumsily, who was proven right, but only after it was too late to matter. It's uncomfortable because it forces us to ask, what if the heroes of the story made catastrophic mistakes? What if Roosevelt's faith in Stalin was naive? What if Eisenhower's political caution was strategic cowardice? What if the decision to let the Soviets take Berlin was the single greatest geopolitical blunder of the 20th century? These aren't popular questions. They undermine the clean narrative of World War II as a purely righteous war with a wholly just outcome. But Patton forces us to ask them. Patton never lived to see the Cold War fully unfold. He never saw the Berlin Wall go up, never saw American and Soviet tanks face each other across Checkpoint Charlie, never saw the world split into two armed camps, each capable of ending civilization. But he predicted all of it, not because he was a political genius, not because he understood ideology or economics or diplomacy, but because he understood something simpler: power. He understood that Stalin respected strength, not promises. That totalitarian regimes don't stop expanding because you ask them nicely. That the only way to prevent a war is to be so prepared for one that your enemy decides not to start it. In his final letter, written from his hospital bed, Patton wrote to his wife, "I have a hunch that the end is near." He was talking about his own death, but he might as well have been talking about the world order he'd tried so hard to preserve. After Patton died, the conversation changed. The warnings stopped. The urgency faded. American policy became what it remained for 40 years: containment. Not victory. Not confrontation. Just endless, patient waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse under its own weight. It worked. Eventually. In 1991, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War ended. But it took nearly half a century. And millions paid the price. Would Patton's way have been better? Would confronting Stalin in 1945 have saved lives, or would it have sparked World War II? While the bodies from World War II were still warm, we can never know. But we know this: George Patton looked at the same situation as every other Allied leader in 1945, and he alone saw clearly what was coming. He alone was willing to say the war wasn't over. It had just changed enemies. He alone understood that the real test wasn't defeating Hitler. It was what came after. And for that, He was silenced, sidelined, and forgotten. Stand in Berlin today. Walk through the Brandenburg Gate. See the memorial where the wall once stood. Ask the people who lived under Soviet rule for those 45 years whether Patton was right. Ask the families divided by barbed wire and minefields. Ask the dissidents who spent decades in gulags for demanding the freedom the Allies promised. Ask the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Hungarians crushed by Soviet tanks in 1956, the Czechs invaded in 1968. They'll tell you Patton was right. Not about everything. Not about denazification. Not about the crude way he expressed himself. But about the fundamental question: did the Allies win the war only to lose the peace? Yes, they did, and one man saw it coming, warned anyone who would listen, and died knowing he'd been ignored. History is not written by who was right. It's written by who won. Patton was right. But Eisenhower won. Marshall won. Truman won. They got to write the story of World War II as a triumph of diplomacy and alliance. They got to present the post-war order as the best possible outcome. And Patton became a footnote. A brilliant but flawed general who didn't understand politics, who said inappropriate things, who died tragically before he could damage his own legacy further. But now, 80 years later, we can look back with clear eyes. We can see that the man they called reckless was actually prescient, that the general they called a warmonger was actually a realist, that the leader they silenced was actually the only one telling the truth. George S. Patton Jr. was right, and everyone else was wrong. The question is, will we make the same mistake again? Because the lesson of Patton's story isn't just about World War II. It's about what happens when leaders choose political convenience over strategic clarity, when they silence uncomfortable truths because admitting them would be difficult, when they win a war but lose the future. Patton understood that winning isn't enough. You have to win the right way, against the right enemy, at the right time. In 1945, America defeated Nazi Germany, but it also empowered Soviet Russia. It won the battle, but Patton saw that it was losing the war, and he died trying to make someone listen.